The Gulag Archipelago. Introduction. In 1994, after 20 years of forced exile in the West, Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn returned to Russia. At one town meeting held on his Trans-Siberian whistle-stop tour to reacquaint himself with his homeland, he was confronted by this rebuke. "It is you and your writing that started it all and brought our country to the verge of collapse and devastation. Russia doesn't need you, so go back to your blessed America." Solzhenitsyn instantly replied that to his dying day he would keep fighting against the evil ideology that was capable of slaying 1/3 of his country's population. The meeting erupted in applause. That sort of exchange was unimaginable when the present abridgment of the Gulag Archipelago first appeared in 1985. Almost no one expected then that within a few years the Soviet Union would collapse, and almost in a day, like the legendary one-horse shay. Yet now the dramatic events that put the closing punctuation mark on the Soviet parentheses in Russian history have also, we may say, brought an end to what the great Russian poet Anna Akhmatova called the true 20th century. This foreshortened century, running from 1914 to 1917 to 1989 to 1991, was the era when utopian dreams rooted in Enlightenment optimism came to rely on brute force to make ideological schemes prevail. The 20th century has proven, in quantitative terms at least, the most murderous in human history, as governments killed their subjects at record rates. For decades, the word Holocaust served as shorthand for modern man's inhumanity to man. Then one lone man added a second such term, Gulag, which now appears in dictionaries as a common noun. Solzhenitsyn was one of the precious few who did anticipate the demise of the Soviet experiment, and he thought his book would help. Oh yes, Gulag was destined to affect the course of history, I was sure of that. On one of his darkest days, February 12th, 1974, the day before he was forced into exile, and precisely because Gulag had appeared in the West, he mused, "You Bolsheviks are finished. There are no two ways about it." What satisfaction he felt then, when some early reviews, such as one from the Frankfurter Allgemeine, a leading German newspaper, caught his intentions. The time may come when we date the beginning of the collapse of the Soviet Union from the appearance of Gulag. American diplomat and scholar George F. Kennan hailed the work as the greatest and most powerful single indictment of a political regime ever to be leveled in modern times. One sure to stick in the craw of the Soviet propaganda machine, with increasing discomfort until it has done its work. Solzhenitsyn has proven prescient on other matters as well. Not only did he reiterate, in the teeth of the prevailing opinion of Western specialists on Soviet affairs, that he was absolutely convinced that communism will go, he also insisted most resolutely, and against all seeming reason, that he expected to be reunited with his beloved Russia. In a strange way, I not only hope, I am inwardly convinced that I shall go back. I mean my physical return, not just my books, and that contradicts all rationality. His improbable prerequisites were that his citizenship be restored, that the charge of treason against him be dropped, and that all his books be published in his homeland. After his prophecies were fulfilled, a friend of his reminisced, "It seemed crazy to me at the time, but it was a real conviction. A poet's knowledge. He sees. The man sees." However historians ultimately apportioned the credit for ending the Cold War, Solzhenitsyn indubitably played a part in bringing the Soviet edifice down to rubble. His writings delegitimized communism in his homeland and discredited it abroad. He was much too modest in depicting himself as a little calf foolishly budding a mighty oak and thinking this could bring it down. As David Remnick, editor of the New Yorker, declares, "In terms of the effect he has had on history, Solzhenitsyn is the dominant writer of this century. Who else compares? Orwell? Kessler?" Remnick concludes that to some extent you have to credit the literary works of Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn with helping to bring down the last empire on earth. It might be supposed that if Solzhenitsyn won his argument with history, or even precisely because he did win it, His relevance is now over, but that would be to presuppose that we have successfully come to terms with the 20th century and have learned its lessons well. Unfortunately, if understandably civilized society, after the brief euphoria of 1989 to 1991, has generally averted its gaze from the dreadful record. As one former denizen of the Gulag, Lev Razgan, put it, people are tired of the past. A review of Solzhenitsyn's record will highlight the historical impact of two of his books. When One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich appeared in 1962, the world's attention was drawn to the cruelty of the Soviet Gulag. At a stroke, a hitherto unknown high school teacher of mathematics and physics was catapulted into newspaper headlines around the globe. In retrospect, that novella can be seen as the first crack in the Berlin Wall. From the platform of fame, the author could launch the Gulag Archipelago. And now it stands as the indispensable text revealing the distinctive character of the age. Through Herculean research efforts into Soviet atrocities, Solzhenitsyn has sketched the panorama and provided many details. Other witnesses and scholars have answered his call to fill in the blank spots in the picture, and the literature of the Gulag continues to be written. The recently published Black Book of Communism, with its global analysis of communism's crimes and repressions, has put a frame around the unfinished picture. A black border, to be sure. Among the gaping spots that remain, we have yet to determine roughly how many politically induced deaths the Soviet regime inflicted. Solzhenitsyn publicizes a demographer's estimate of some 60 million. Alexander Yakovlev, a high official in the Gorbachev regime and now chairman of Russia's Commission for the Rehabilitation of the Victims of Political Repression, estimates the number at perhaps 35 million. Also, he admits that his generation allowed those monsters Lenin and Stalin to kill us, and that it is high time for him and others to repent, to apologize to those who survived, and to kneel before the millions who were shot. Yakovlev's penitential posture accords with Solzhenitsyn's moral vision. A key passage in Gulag proclaims, "So let the reader who expects this book to be a political exposé slam its covers shut right now." The passage proceeds to specify that moral matters are fundamental because the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. Given the nature of the Soviet experiment, the political dimension of life is never far from Solzhenitsyn's mind, but he always approaches politics in moral terms. Anyone, then, who views the human reality primarily through the prism of politics will misread Gulag. Elsewhere, Solzhenitsyn complains about those who always insist on regarding me in political terms, completely missing the point that this is not my framework, not my task, and not my dimension. Far from limiting himself to politics, he attends primarily to the timeless essence of humanity, to those fixed universal concepts called good and justice. To read Gulag through a moral lens is to understand that government power can perpetuate all sorts of atrocities upon human beings, body and soul, but it can never fully succeed in quenching the human spirit. Yes, some people will submit and will die spiritually, but others, like Ivan Denisovich, will endure and prevail. Despite all the indignities inflicted upon them, their innate human dignity will remain intact. In this sense, totalitarianism must always fail. In Solzhenitsyn's case, the moral vision grows organically from a religious commitment. Passages in Gulag describe his move from Marx to Christ during his years of incarceration, a change of heart amplified in subsequent writings. Because religious faith is his bedrock conviction, the greatest impediment to appreciating and appropriating Solzhenitsyn has been the error of listening to his sad music of Russia with ears attuned solely to secular wavelengths. Many Western admirers, who in the early years of Solzhenitsyn's fame had lionized him as an anti-totalitarian freedom fighter, reacted with shock and dismay when in 1972 he publicized his Christian faith. The static interfering with this Western reception increased when the now exiled writer, in speaking to Western audiences about the West, voiced moral criticism in tones many judged to be overly harsh. Intellectuals and journalists developed a negative consensus about him, which was memorably captured by American critic Jerry Labor's complaint in 1974 that he is not the liberal that we would like him to be. That consensus hardened over the following 2 decades. By the 1990s, the Western response to Solzhenitsyn could be called schizophrenic. On one hand, the misrepresentations encased within the negative consensus caused David Remnick to lament that, when Solzhenitsyn's name comes up, now it is more often than not as a freak, a monarchist, an anti-Semite, a crank, a has-been, not as a hero. On the other hand, Solzhenitsyn was widely reported to be the most admired living Russian by a Western press that couldn't quite fathom why. Now that the abridged version of the Gulag Archipelago returns to print, the 25 to 30% of it that survived my knife, readers can form their judgments afresh. The usual first reaction to any act of abridgment is that it is a bad business, almost a desecration. Yet here's a book that has been translated into 35 languages and has sold more than 30 million copies, nearly 3 million in the United States alone, and nonetheless remains more known about than known. On the many occasions when I have lectured on Solzhenitsyn, members of the audience have told me that they have read the first 100 or so pages of Volume 1, but never, despite good intentions, returned to read the rest. We can identify 3 obstacles that deflect readers. First, the work is very long, more than 1,800 pages. Second, some parts depend upon more knowledge of Russian and Soviet history than all but a few Western readers have. Third, the many accumulated horror stories engender a sense of depression that overwhelms all but the most persevering readers. Therefore, my work of abridgment has been governed by several specifiable principles and procedures. First and foremost, I have kept in mind a Western readership, one with only a limited knowledge of Russian history. Of course, it is impossible to take the Russianness out of this book, and I would not want to do so if I could. The work is, after all, written by a Russian and primarily for Russians. But the sections that highlight universal moral values preponderate in this volume. Second, I have retained the 7-part structure of the original, which actually can be perceived more clearly in a 1-volume abridgment than in its 3-volume entirety. I have sought to provide a sense of the whole work and its developing argument, not merely a series of disconnected excerpts. Third, I have resisted the urge to explain and comment. The few interpolated words of my own are strictly transitional. Fourth, I have tried to leave as few marks of excision as possible. Wherever possible, I have given no indication that passages have been deleted. Where the stitching is obvious, I have resorted to the semi-apology of inserting ellipsis points. For the most part, I hope that without consulting the original, it is not apparent where the stitching occurred. Chapters that have been deleted entirely are summarized in a sentence or 2. The same is true of the few chapters which are cut so deeply that the sense of them cannot be gleaned from the remaining passages. At Solzhenitsyn's own suggestion, I have eliminated much of his personal story, though parts of it I treasure too much to drop. In sum, I have striven for maximum readability. This abridged text is designed for the general reader, not for the scholar. The full text, including footnotes and explanatory glosses, remains available for all those who wish to consult it. Surprisingly, this abridgment contains several short passages that have still not appeared in translations of the work as a whole, though they do appear in the author's collected works in Russian. We now know the fascinating story of how Solzhenitsyn composed the Gulag Archipelago, on the run and largely while at his hiding place in Estonia. From Invisible Allies, his tribute to his co-workers in the literary underground. This material will eventually appear in its proper place as part of an augmented edition of his autobiographical, The Oak and the Calf. Just as he lightened that work by holding parts out, so he initially withheld parts of Gulag. Such was the nature of the clandestine literature of the Soviet Gulag. One obstacle that an abridgment should not try too hard to resolve is the cumulative effect of unrelieved horror. Solzhenitsyn knows what he is up against. Does it seem, he asks at various times, that I am repeating myself? It is the Gulag, he explains, that keeps repeating itself. Anyone who stays the course, however, will discover that the final note of this work, as of virtually all his works, is the note of hope. So even if the abridged version is too long for some readers, they should skip ahead to such chapters as The Ascent and The 40 Days of Kengir to discover why Solzhenitsyn is hopeful. There they will discover why, despite the common misimpression of him as a Jeremiah figure, he considers himself an unshakable optimist. As he wrote to me in a letter of advice about my work of abridging, the main goal, the main sense of Archipelago, is a moral uplifting and catharsis. I must add that the author gave me considerably more help on this project than I ever could have hoped for. I deeply appreciate his many personal kindnesses. Any errors of omission or commission are mine alone. Solzhenitsyn once told me he thought that in the long run he would be best remembered in the West through this abridgment of the Gulag Archipelago. Perhaps one who has been right so often about so much will turn out to be right about this hope too. End of the Gulag Archipelago Abridgement Introduction. Introduction Part 2 by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. In 1949, some friends and I came upon a noteworthy news item in Nature, a magazine of the Academy of Sciences. It reported in tiny type that in the course of excavations on the Kolyma River, a subterranean ice lens had been discovered, which was actually a frozen stream. And in it were found frozen specimens of prehistoric fauna some tens of thousands of years old. Whether fish or salamander, these were preserved in so fresh a state, the scientific correspondent reported that those present immediately broke open the ice encasing the specimens and devoured them with relish on the spot. The magazine, no doubt, astonished its small audience with the news of how successfully the flesh of fish could be kept fresh in a frozen state. But few, indeed, among its readers were able to decipher the genuine and heroic meaning of this incautious report. As for us, however, we understood instantly. We could picture the entire scene right down to the smallest details. How those present broke up this ice in frenzied haste, how, flouting with the higher claims of ichthyology and elbowing each other to be the first, they tore off chunks of the prehistoric flesh and hauled them over to the bonfire to thaw them out and bolt them down. We understood because we ourselves were the same kind of people as those present at the event. We, too, were from that powerful tribe of Zeks, unique on the face of the earth, the only people who could devour prehistoric salamander with relish. And the Kolyma was the greatest and most famous island, the pole of ferocity that the amazing country of Gulag, which, though scattered in an archipelago geographically, was, in the psychological sense, fused into a continent, an almost invisible, almost imperceptible country inhabited by the Zek people. And this archipelago crisscrossed and patterned that other country within which it was located, like a gigantic patchwork, cutting into its cities, hovering over its streets. Yet there were many who did not even guess at its presence, and many, many others who had heard something vague, and only those who had been there knew the whole truth. But, as though stricken dumb on the islands of the archipelago, they kept their silence. By an unexpected turn of our history, a bit of the truth, an insignificant part of the whole, was allowed out in the open. But those same hands which once skewed tight our handcuffs now hold out their palms in reconciliation. No, don't dig up the past. Dwell on the past and you'll lose an eye. But the proverb goes on to say, forget the past and you'll lose both eyes. Decades go by, and the scars and sores of the past are healing over for good. In the course of this period, some of the islands of the archipelago have shuddered and dissolved, and the polar sea of oblivion rolls over them. And someday in the future, this archipelago, its air and bones of its inhabitants, frozen in a lens of ice, will be discovered by our descendants like some improbable salamander. I have never had the chance to read the documents, and, in fact, will anyone ever have the chance to read them? Those who do not wish to recall have already had enough time, and will have more, to destroy all the documents, down to the very last one. I have absorbed into myself my own 11 years there, not as something shameful, nor as a nightmare to be cursed. I have come, almost, to love that monstrous world, and now, by a happy turn of events, I have also been entrusted with many recent reports and letters, so perhaps I shall be able to give some account of the bones and flesh of that salamander, which, incidentally, is still alive. End of Solzhenitsyn introduction.